growing a head of lettuce in a vertical farm will most likely always be more expensive than growing it in a field in Italy. The future growers and investors and customers are taking the learnings from what have we seen for the last decade or so and are becoming really, really smart about how do we become more energy efficient? How do we make sure we bring the right investors on board? How do we make sure we automate in the right areas? For example, transportation or monitoring. And we think mobile robots will have a big role to play in wave 3 of vertical farms.
If you've been following the vertical farming industry in the recent years, you probably know that one of the key challenges for the entire industry is basically the question, how do you scale up vertical farms without losing profitability? This is actually one of the reasons why I'm super excited to have with me Dan Nielsen today. Dan, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thanks, Oliver. I'm great. Thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to having a chat.
So, Dan, you're the head of strategy for Seasony, Copenhagen-based tech company looking, at least according to your website, looking to make the future of vertical farming profitable, scalable, and also more sustainable. That's quite a challenge. And you guys have come up with a really cool solution to do this by basically automating some of the key processes in vertical farming by using something that you call modular autonomous mobile robots. Can you please explain?
Yeah, sure. So I think in short, you could say that what we try to do at Seasony is to bring the best practices from warehouse automation into the world of indoor farming. So you might be familiar with, Oliver, the videos of the Amazon warehouses and big retail warehouses where mobile robotics have gone in and automated some of these kind of key processes, especially around transportation, data monitoring, all this stuff that is super repetitive and labor intensive. And basically we try to bring the same best practices into indoor farming and have designed a tailored mobile robot, autonomous mobile robot for the needs of the, especially vertical farm and indoor farming more broadly down the line. So that's kind of been our goal.
Cool. Awesome. Your robot also has a really fun name. What's the story behind it?
Our first kind of flagship product is called Watney. It's named after Mark Watney, who you might know from the famous movie and book The Martian, played wonderfully by Matt Damon, of course. The idea is that part of the DNA in Seasony is that indoor farming and these modern growing technologies, whereas, vertical farming is kind of at the forefront, is part of the building blocks of becoming a multidisciplinary species, moving into space, all these things. So kind of our, 100-year, 1,000-year vision is that, we're part of that journey going into space. And that's where the name came from. Great movie, by the way, if you haven't watched it.
So basically you are so Watney is your pirate ship, and you're taking a ride to space with Watney.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, you could say that. At least that's where we want to start.
Awesome. So first, I thought that we could basically set the stage for the discussion by taking a bit of a look at the history of automation, specifically in vertical farming. So, in short, at least in my perspective, vertical farms have gone through multiple stages of automation development during the last decade or so. How would you, in your own words, describe this timeline? So where did everything start from, and where are we today?
Yeah, it's a super good question. We typically speak about vertical farming in 3 waves. So vertical farming as a technology is, let's say, broadly available for the last decade or so, maybe a little bit longer. Started primarily in Asia, especially in Japan, which is kind of the birthplace a little bit of vertical farming. And that first wave started with primarily human-driven farms. So, even some of the basic controls, but especially when it came to harvesting, seeding, transplanting, transport, all the key processes were manually driven. So that was really the first wave, but that showed what are some of the potential benefits that are in the technology. So recirculation of water, precision fertigation, irrigation, how to use light to grow year round, all the benefits that we know about. That is kind of the value proposition of vertical farms. Then we saw a shift, maybe let's say 5 years ago, where vertical farming moved from being a, let's say, kind of a niche technology, and it started to mature really, really fast, funded by very, very large investments across the world. So you had a huge injection of capital into the industry from everyone from Walmart, venture capital funds, private equity funds, to Justin Timberlake, right? There was everybody, threw money at this industry.
Everybody and their mother, basically.
Exactly. It got extremely, extremely hyped and attracted enormous amounts of capital. And in that period, that's what we typically call wave 2, is where you saw what happened when you made vertical farming into like a real technology focused industry. So you tried to really inject all the technology you could. And what we saw in that period was a number of companies opened. A lot of them are unfortunately no longer with us. And a lot of the companies used these enormous amounts of capital to invest in very, very automated units. You had some of the companies that have now unfortunately gone bankrupt who spent, 2 or 3 digit million of euros into facilities that are end-to-end automated. Lots of robots, lots of computer power and control all over the place. But I think what we also saw from wave 2 was that vertical farming is still about growing a crop. And, a head of lettuce is, no matter how you look at it, still a low margin product. So the capital expenditure you needed to invest to keep these units afloat and what actually came out was a mismatch. So when the market turned, and here market, I'm talking market in general, inflation went up, interest rates went up, all of a sudden these enormous amounts of investments were no longer viable. Venture capital market dried up, debt market dried up, all these things. And a lot of these companies that had still not found their ground, I think, went into some troubles.
And actually, if I can interject here, there's going to be a lot of talk about CapEx and OpEx and their impacts on vertical farming. Could you just actually explain to our audience just quickly, what do these terms mean and what do they mean specifically as it comes to vertical farming?
Remember, not everyone has gone to business school. That's right. No, but you basically split, when you talk about costs in any company, you talk about capital expenditures, which is CapEx, and operational expenditure, which is OpEx. Capital expenditure is investment. So you take a pot of money and you buy a new machine, or you buy a new building or something. You make a big upfront investment. So that's capital expenditure, or CapEx. So buying a new fancy vertical farming facility, you invest a lot of money. That's a big CapEx. Operational expenditure, or OpEx, is what it actually takes to run the business. So think about energy bill, a salary cost, seeding cost, all these things that it actually takes to run the business. So that's the key differentiator between the two. And typically, CapEx is something you borrow, or you attract an investor, or something you need to get a lot of money into the company that you can then spend. Whereas operational expenditure, at least to some degree, should be financed by the operation of the business. So you sell a head of lettuce and that money goes back to pay somebody's salary. That kind of circle of life, so to say.
Absolutely, and a great explanation. And as a segue back to the heads of lettuce, not the most expensive product to sell. Margins are quite thin.
Yeah.
So please continue.
Yeah, no, so I think what we're heading in now is what we're calling wave 3 of vertical farming, and I think it's something Seasony's talking about. I don't think it's a general approach, but we see a new wave of vertical farms that emerge, where with the future growers and investors and customers are taking the learnings from what have we seen for the last decade or so, and are becoming really, really smart about how do we become more energy efficient. How do we make sure we source our energy in the right way? How do we make sure we automate in the right areas? How do we make sure we bring the right investors on board? Who's going to be our customer? How do we make the right distribution agreements based on our size? All these things are moving into wave 3. And from an automation perspective, where we play a role with mobile robotics, we see that, you've gone from very, very labor intensive to maybe in wave 2, we say over automation in some degrees, but at least very, very heavy automation, to somewhere in the middle, sometimes you call it semi-automation, where you automate what makes sense, and you're very, very smart about how you automate the rest. For example, transportation or monitoring. How do you actually do that in the farm? And we think mobile robots ourselves and probably other companies will have a big role to play in Wave 3 of vertical farms.
Super interesting. And let's dig deeper into the automation in just a second. But would I assume correctly that, in your opinion, there was a bit of an overcorrection per se with automation in Wave 2, where the labor intensive portions were just overly automated, as you just said?
Yes, and I think it's also just the dynamics of being in a market that grows really, really fast. Vertical farming is not unique in being an emergent, exciting technology. You've also had crypto and Web3 and renewable energies before that have all gone through this wave where, when the opportunities of that technology kind of emerges, you have a bunch of investors that jumps on. AI is the example we're looking at right now, where you flood in so much capital, and then if you are a company that have venture investors, you are also under a certain amount of pressure to create, innovative solutions and show how you can become a market leader, do things in a new way. And I think that's what a lot of these companies try to do, I think with good intention, by the way, saying, we have a different way where we can bring down the labor costs so much. We can do things in a such smarter way. And then some circumstances kind of didn't fall out in that way. But yeah, I think that you take a retail warehouse. If you look at a big warehouse today, there's some SKUs, so some things in the warehouse that is moved only by robots and conveyors and things like that. So think in a supermarket warehouse, it's toilet paper and eggs or whatever, things that you need to move so much. But then there's other parts of the warehouse where you have less throughput, as it's called. And in those areas of the warehouse, you'll still today see people, you'll see forklifts, and you'll see mobile robots. And that's the way it is today. Vertical farming is very, very often closer to the latter part than the first. Only in the cases where you really have enormous amounts of throughput do you need to move your produce so much that it can justify the investments in what we call static automation. It can in some cases, and it becomes a little bit nerdy about how do you optimize the best, but automation is only good when it serves a business case purpose, right? And that balance can be difficult to hit.
You already mentioned that we basically had some really big issues during the past 24 or 36 months from this moment backwards, and there are many companies that are no longer with us. I think there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of blogs, there's a lot of opinions on the market, including with, we have our own thoughts about the market as well. But in your opinion, adding on top of what you just said, what do you think were some of the biggest reasons for some of these very public, very large failures by some of the large first movers?
Yeah. To be honest, I think upfront, and it might be a little bit of a contrarian view, but I think we also need to move beyond the discussion of the bankruptcies and the issue. So first of all, I think it's true that vertical farming has gone through a slump of capital and bankruptcies. I think in reality, when I joined Seasony, that was exactly 2 years ago. And that was just when the crisis hit. That was with the war and the inflation and everything. And I'd say it's much closer to 12 to an 18-month period where then the capital market collapsed and you saw a lot of issues. So I think first of all the period has been shorter, and it's a few big names that have kind of collapsed, and then more companies that have not really gotten the momentum they wanted. So there's been a lot of plans that were then stranded. We can see that from our own sales pipeline, vertical farms we found that doesn't exist anymore, which is fair. That's what happens. It's startups, right? Startups cannot continue if there's no capital. So I think, to be honest, I think we're already moved beyond this kind of slump. So true, we've gone through some bankruptcies. There's some companies that have had an issue, but the companies that have made it through, I think, are very, very solid. And the state we're in now, we can see it ourselves. We're also out raising capital for our own company, right? The capital market have returned. Now we're at a state again where you cannot go a week without a new vertical farm being announced, whether that's in, vertical harvest in States, or refarm in the Middle East, or, collaborations in Norway with Avicimo. It happens all over the place now. And I think that momentum is regaining. You can start to see the interest again from the people that are actually moving the needle on the wave 3 of vertical farms. So I think, true, there's been that slump. Then, you could say, why did that happen to begin with? And I think the primary driver was capital. Capital markets drew up. When you're in a growing phase and capital stops, you struggle. And that's not just vertical farming, that's all startups. But if you look specifically at our industry, I think, the classic ones are, did the companies have enough operational capacity or capability, or were they too focused on the technology? I'm not entirely sure, but that's at least what I've heard from other people discussing the industry, saying there was too little focus on how to actually run a farming operation. And then I think the second part is, when it comes to automation, then you typically want to find, very well-defined pain points. I think in some cases you went in to automate pain points that you had yet to experience. So, that's a struggle. But now, as we're looking into the new wave, you're seeing, the talent from the previous work moving into those next wave of industry. So all the people that have gone through that period are now working on new projects and take all their learnings with them. And I see the people that we're talking to, we talk to a lot of vertical farms, are so much smarter about their operations. And they're so much smarter about making the good decisions about, when do we need to invest in more technology and when do we need to focus on our core operations, and having that balance, right? So, at least what we're seeing.
And I think that you just hit the nail on the head is before we move to actual automation and what kind of automation systems there are, what do you think are the, for example, top 3 biggest lessons learned from the previous slump, and now with you mentioned that there's a new vertical farm announced every single week. In my opinion, there's still a lot of these vertical farms who seem to step into the same traps as some companies before. So what would be some of the biggest overall learnings that we should take as an industry?
Yeah, I think one, that kind of core focus on operational efficiency. So actually having a process that works, that runs, where you can deliver consistent output at consistent quality at a consistent cost base. So actually focusing in on having that kind of operational turn. 2, being, I think, much more smarter about what to automate and when. So the actual facility design, I think the value of flexibility, the value of finding the right balance, coming back to our discussion again, what do we invest in now? What do we invest in later? So maybe not like, I don't know if there's an English term for this, but like bake the biggest cake to begin with. Let's start to bake a small cake and then grow from there, right?
Yes.
But being smart about that, and making the right analysis and the right decision from the get-go. And then I think the last part is this talent piece. I just think there's much more vertical farming talent out in the industry now that kind of can bring their best practices or better practices into the future farms.
Oh, absolutely. I think this last point is super, super important, because the first wave, basically no one knew what vertical farming was, and people were jumping into the industry with different types of backgrounds, which were definitely useful, but we had to learn everything from scratch. And now we have this new wave of talent, as you mentioned, who are able to jump from companies that are no longer with us to these new ventures, taking all of their learnings, all of the experience with them, which is incredibly valuable, and we have benefited from this as well.
Yeah.
But to your second point about what automation to choose from in the first place and what to build on next, what kind of automations are needed in vertical farming in general?
Yeah.
What do you need to automate?
Yeah. So I think to begin with, you can kind of split vertical farms into two, and I think it's an important distinction because there's room for both. There's the what do we call them? The small vertical farms, the small community farms that grow maybe just a couple of meters in a basement in the city. These kind of community farms, they sell directly to the consumer. These farms need very, very little level of automation. A container farm, for example, things like that. So if we park those, I think these farms will continue to exist, and I think they're doing great, by the way, is my general perception. And then the other side is when you then talk about what's sometimes called a plant factory, like a large-scale growing facility where you basically have like greenhouse-size production area in a vertical setup. When you then look at that, the obvious automation is everything that has to do with control. I've yet to see some that don't have that, but in theory you could have people going and turning on and shutting off the water and mixing the irrigation by hand and turning on and turning off the HVAC unit, all these things. In some greenhouses that's still what you do, but I think in most vertical farms, once you hit a certain size, all of the controls are automated. Not always very cleverly, maybe it's different systems. Let's not get into that, but it's automated to some degree.
Yes.
Sure. Which is always a big benefit about, I've heard how much time is actually just spent in greenhouses opening and shutting windows to keep the temperature. This is not something to play around with.
Turning manual timers every single week.
Yes, exactly. So controls is like the bar one, and I think that's where most are. Then I think the first place people are looking to automate, once we're beyond lighting, controls, irrigation, that control loop. When you're then looking at the periphery of the growing, I think the first area where companies are looking to automate are those that are really repetitive, really labor intensive, which is seeding, harvesting, packaging, transplanting if possible. But these tasks or processes that are just so repetitive and take so much time, and which are standardized to some degree. It differs depending on the size of the farm when certain things make sense, but I think these are the processes that most companies look to automate the first, especially things like packaging, which is very, very difficult to do, or very time consuming to do by hand. Not difficult, it's very easy, but time consuming and a terrible job to have, by the way. Or seeding, yes. Right? Manual seeding is also quite
seeding, especially, yes.
Yeah, and here in that part of automation, you have a huge spillover from the greenhouse world. So the TTAs, which is a company, an automation company, those kind of companies have seeding machines, transplanting machines, all these kind of things. They spill over into vertical farming because it's the same. It's a centralized point where you kind of process your crops. Then you have the next steps, which is also where Seasony starts to play a role, and that's when it comes to transportation. Transportation is really the kind of Achilles heel of vertical farming because you have the vertical element. If you need to do it by human labor, you need to send somebody on a scissor lift. If you need to do it by static automation, you need to install an elevator and all these things. But the plants do need to move typically during a transplant phase. So, your plant has grown a little bit. Now it needs a bigger tray, or it needs more space in the tray to grow even further. You need to move, fresh trays into the growing system. You need to move them out to harvest. So the actual transportation of trays and plants to and from the growing system, that's a place that's our bread and butter. That's where we're talking to vertical farms about how to automate that in a smarter way.
Right.
Doing it with people is repetitive, takes a lot of time. It's even a little bit dangerous and at least very, very uncomfortable. Right. I've been on enough scissor lifts all my life to say I didn't want to do that 8 hours a day, for sure. Yes. And the second is, doing it with static automation. If you need to start to install elevator systems and conveyors beyond the sheer cost of it, you then need to start caging in your growing facility. So you can't just have a conveyor belt or an elevator. Like, you need to keep it away from human beings, which makes, it's not impossible. You have these enclosed units and they work okay. But it's a different type of farm where you kind of remove the human connection to the plant, which I'm personally not a big fan of. But I think the cost element is the biggest one. So that's transportation. And then the last part is monitoring. So part of having a greenhouse or a vertical farm or a normal farm is monitoring climate and growing, looking at your plants, detecting things are going as they're supposed to. Do we need to tweak some things? And that monitoring today in vertical farms are primarily done by, static climate sensors and then people walking around looking at the plant, what's called a crop walk.
Right.
And automating that has enormous potential. All the farms almost we talk to say, we would like a better view of our climate. We only have 8 sensors across these 1,000 square meters. So we have points of climate control and we don't look enough at our plants. So if there's a mold outbreak on level 12, you're not going to see that in time. If there for some reason is, beginning tip burn or whatever it might be, just because you need to spend so much time monitoring, it's difficult to do. So there we also think there's an enormous opportunity to automate and do it much smarter, both to maybe save money, but actually also to create a better feedback loop for the grower where they get more insights about their facility and their plants. So yeah, controls is base play, then seeding, harvesting, packaging is kind of like first in line, and then comes transport and monitoring as automation opportunities.
And this is fascinating because, for example, if you look at the Chief Science Officer of Plenty, the US-based vertical farming company, he originally founded his company Bright Agrotech, where he pioneered the vertically inclined growing surfaces, specifically using the growing towers. And one of his arguments, or he had a couple of very intriguing arguments that we actually took close to heart with small-scale systems, is, first of all, exactly what you mentioned, the crop walk. It takes a lot of time, especially if you use stacked systems where you can only go above 3-4 levels, and then you can... you're no longer able to see and reach what you're actually working on, which means that then you have to have separate monitoring systems. You might use drones, you might use heat sensors, humidity sensors, airflow sensors, but you need an enormous amount of these sensors across your farm, exactly as mentioned, because then otherwise you might have pockets of disease or pockets of problems here and there. And the other thesis that he had, which was very interesting at that time, this is already almost 10 years ago, he was talking about bringing the plants to the process, not the process to the plants itself. So they planned their original Bright Agrotech zip tower systems so that they would be wheeled to their processing area, from where they could be taken back to the growing area. So instead of moving the irrigation or moving all the tools, packaging, everything that you need for the logistics, instead of moving them to the plants, you would move the plants to the processes. And of course, they have since automated all of this in quite spectacular way at Plenty, which has a very different approach to many of the other companies, operators around the globe. But I think there are so many different interesting learnings about all of the topics that you mentioned that we've learned from during the past 10 years, from taking small learnings from different companies, and now it's coming together, for example, with your solution, which is super cool. And talking of which, I already mentioned drones. That's something that many companies have been looking into. So fully autonomous drones that would be monitoring the systems, which is an interesting idea, where you can fly your drone from place A to place B, have no human interference. But then again, that's missing the loading, offloading, moving part that you guys are doing. What kind of other automation methods are there on the markets?
I think just on the drones part, I've also seen some of them, and there's super exciting stuff. It works great for outdoor. it works to some extent in greenhouses. I've yet to really see it beyond, the companies that win the innovation awards and at the fairs and everything. I've seen some
Sure.
some proof of concepts. iFarm tries to do some drone thing, for example. I've not seen it yet, just to say. So drones is also a very, very early technology. And it will take a long time before that can become an established part of a monitoring routine in a vertical farm. So just saying, it's super great. It's not as mature yet, I think. So yeah, I'm a little hesitant on the drone thing. Also, as you said, there's some restrictions to what it can do. But as a monitoring tool, it has amazing capabilities, right? And a lot of flexibility.
Oh, absolutely. And I think using drones or drone technology, autonomous systems in general, it speaks to the volume of solutions that we have for automation, which is, in a sense, it's a good thing because different companies are approaching this topic from different perspectives. And then, of course, only the viable, profitable systems will then last in the long term. But talking about this topic, could you just run the audience through the general list of automation systems that are being used today? How is the field fractured? What kind of solutions are there?
It comes back to what I said before, right? There's control software typically embedded in the system already. So the company that has built the system has a control software to control lighting, HVACs, irrigation, fertigation stuff that's typically embedded. Often you have a layer on top which is for or sometimes called a farm management system, or think of it as kind of a warehouse management system where you run your recipes and your rotation schedule. So that's a piece of software which is, it's an Excel sheet on speed. You could do it in Excel or in a piece of paper. I'm not sure I would recommend it, but it's possible. Typically also embedded in the system, or there are some companies out there that develop these kind of management systems, which is also an automation of sorts, very, very difficult. Then when it comes to the peripheries, as we talked about, there are the TTAs of the world. There are other companies like them that automate either some or all of the process. And then when it gets closer to the rack, where we see a hole in the market is that there's very, very few companies that's actually able to automate the journey of a tray to and from a growth rack, or a sensor to and from the growth rack. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to be naive, but I genuinely don't think there are any other mobile robotics companies in the vertical farming industry. We just do it very differently. The automation that comes into vertical farming comes in the shape of either fully automated enclosed systems. So you have a Logix or an Artecno or something where it's like an enclosed box you put somewhere with elevators and conveyors and everything.
Right.
You can't, when you start to then talk about like automating then you start to talk custom development of heavy duty robotic arm, conveyor belts, things like that. You have a company like Bosman van Zaal, for example, who's done some work for some vertical farms installing some very, very heavy duty stuff. They, of course, also do a lot of greenhouse automation and try to bring that same way of thinking into the vertical farm. So, you have some players that do some custom stuff, and you have some system developers that do these kind of enclosed units. What we try to do is something that's a little bit more system agnostic, to say, you can have an open floor plan, an open unit where you don't need to install static equipment, but you can bring trays to and from the grow rack and bring whatever equipment and sensors and stuff you have to and from there. If that makes sense.
Right. And so this takes us to the conversation between static and mobile systems. You mentioned that static systems, they work with elevators, conveyor belts. Some use almost Tesla car factory type robotic arms and very heavy duty systems as well.
Very cool.
But they are still stuck in place. They're located in that particular space. And going back to the capex and opex discussion, sure, they can decrease your operating costs. They do have high electricity cost and maintenance cost, but they can take the human labor out of it. But at the same time, they require huge capital investments upfront before you even start growing your first lettuce, head of lettuce. Yeah. So how do these kind of static automation systems and mobile robotics differ, in your opinion? And what are the main, benefits, disadvantages of both systems?
Yeah. So before I start selling my own product here, give you the sales pitch, I just want to maybe make the case for full automation. I think when it comes to these static conveyor belts and arms, they are extremely efficient, right? It's an efficiency game. That's why you use it for cars and high throughput. You can really transport a lot of stuff through. So it's really an efficiency thing. And looking at some of these big like Cougar robotics arms and these things, they are amazingly cool. I love them. I just think they are overdimensioned, often to the need of the vertical farms, and comes with some other kind of downsides. Sure. I think there's a couple of categories to consider. One, you mentioned it, is the upfront investment. People who have seriously looked into the cost of static automation know the price tag. We're talking thousands of euros or dollars per meter of conveyor belt. It's very, very expensive. That is capital that you need in addition to building your vertical farm to begin with. Top of line numbers, a vertical, a simple vertical farm with automated controls, so irrigation. So the basic controls we talked about before will cost in the area of 1,000 euros per square meter of growing. In the area of that. So 1,000 square meter growing, about €1 million ish. That varies, but let's keep that space. Sure. If you then go to a fully automated unit, and I think no matter what the supplier is, I don't want to mention any one specific, but I think they would nod along. You can easily double that number. So if you need one of these kind of like boxes where everything is automated, you have your conveyors, you have your elevators, you have your things just move around by itself, you can easily double that. So you go from 1,000 square meters of growing costing €1 million, $1 million ish, to 2 million. That's an extra €1 million per 1,000 square meters you need to raise upfront. So you either need to borrow it or you need to find an investor that's willing to put that money in. With that then comes a lower operating expenditure. You need to hire fewer people and everything. So there's a benefit, but that benefit doesn't come until after 24 months. You've done your seeding, you've done your harvesting, you're starting to actually sell your produce. So you pay today and you get your benefit in 2 years, which is the nature of CapEx. So the upfront investment definitely, and it is very, very big. And you add more CapEx to an already CapEx intensive produce. Then I think the second part, which is equally important, is actually space efficiency. So like, if you need to add an elevator to a rack, you need to take up some space. Conveyors takes up space. Like it just takes up a lot of space. Space is expensive. Even if the vertical farm is not in the middle of the city, if it's by a distribution center, for example, it's still expensive square meters that you would rather grow. You're still doing all your climate controls for this nice conveyor, so that conveyor will have the perfect humidity and all this stuff, right? But you would rather just grow stuff there, right? So it takes up a lot of space. So space efficiency is definitely a big thing, and that's the benefit of using scissor lifts or using mobile robots. They just take up much, much less space in the floor plan, and you can add more square meters of growing on the same floor plan. The third, I have a few here, sorry, but I'll run through them all.
Go on.
The third is having something that's a safe space for plants and for humans. And I think there's two things here we rarely discuss. One, I mentioned before, conventional automation needs you to cage in your areas, your plants. There's a lot of areas in your floor plan that will be no-go for human beings. And there's a reason for that. Like you can get seriously hurt if you get into a fight with a conveyor belt. So that's one thing, but also for the plant's sake, a vertical farm needs to be cleaned. Like, it's living organisms. There's a lot of biological material going through here. There's a lot of water with fertilizer. You need to clean this stuff. And the more you cage in everything, the more difficult it is to clean. So cleaning procedures in terms of like the safety of the plants and keeping that healthy is definitely also something worth thinking about. Again, you know, robotics or more flexible automation leaves that space so you can more easily access the plants, and you don't have these machines in the way of the human. I think sustainability is something to think about. When we look at our carbon footprint analysis, you know, you can do these LC analysis, life cycle analysis, or greenhouse gas protocol analysis, these type of things. One of the really big sinners is steel. Every time, you know, I think it's, you know, 1 ton of steel equals about 1.5 ton of CO2 equivalents, if I'm not mistaken. But you know,
it's a huge factor in especially with this volume. Absolutely,
especially right, and exactly. And the vertical farm already uses a lot of steel, but if you then also add the elevators and the conveyors and the robotic arms, it's then, you know, maybe even, you know, tens of tons of extra steel you add. Having mobile robots, it's a single unit that's being used throughout the day, so just your steel footprint alone is much smaller. I think it's worth talking about. Then it's a matter of flexibility. If you install static automation, it is exactly that. It's static, so you lock yourself into a floor plan. And if you decide to change your layout, change your workflow, change things like that, it just becomes a lot more difficult. Whereas more flexible solutions, you can kind of alter things around. The way that we work with the robot is that it maps the facility, but then if you decide, you know what, we're putting in another rack here, and this rack we're turning the other way, then we just remap the facility and the robot still knows where to go. If you need to reinstall your conveyors, actually, then you're in a kind of a different space there, right?
Oh, absolutely. And actually adding to this point is especially in situations where you have a static system that you've built without the added layer of automation, elevators, additional conveyor belts, and you want to add those to the system after the fact. Well, that's another issue to talk about, because then either you will have to originally have had to rent a larger facility with space to expand, or then you'll basically be forced to cut on your production in order to fit those static automation systems in. So there's, you mentioned flexibility, the flexibility for scaling, changing our operation.
Exactly.
A lot of these, and I guess one of the big problems with a lot of vertical farms has been that if you start with a certain product and you then want to change that, and that product change forces you to make physical changes to your system, that's a huge investment, not only in time but money, but also it means that your system is going to be, especially if the whole system operates as a one, you have to basically cease operations for that entire time duration.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. Getting locked into a certain capex investment, if you will, is I think a huge risk that a lot of companies haven't really thought about before.
Yes. And then if that elevator or if that conveyor breaks, then you're stuck. Typically, you have heavier trays and heavier stuff to move around because you designed it for a heavy duty conveyor belt. But then you have a problem. Then you can't have a human lifting it or something like that. So having the opportunity to add some flexibility, some redundancy in the system, that's very good. And then I think just the last thing I want to mention is that most farms don't start at 100% from day one. They ramp up their production. You don't have really that opportunity with static automation. You need everything, typically at least, unless it's designed in a different way. You typically need everything in place before you can get started. Whereas with the mobile robotic solution, you can kind of ramp up. Okay, we'll start with a single robot, and then when we hit 50%, then we'll add another one, and then we'll add another one. Oh, now we went down in production, then we'll maybe take out a robot. So there's a lot more flexibility in your ramp up and actually dimensioning your automation to the needs of your production output, which we think is a pretty big advantage in these still early days of vertical farming where maybe the demand market is not entirely sure, or, things can change. And having that flexibility, we think, is a big benefit.
Absolutely. And so where does Seasony come in here? What you've already spoken a bit about, but give us your pitch really quickly.
Yeah. We think that if you have a facility, I think even from 500 square meters of growing and up, looking at ideally already from the design phase of the different opportunities to automate, and having the conversation between, okay, let us get down to business and look at the most important KPI of the vertical farm, which is cost per kilo output, and say, okay, how do we get to that point in a good way where this can be a sustainable business? What areas should we do with people? What areas should we do with full automation? And what areas should we consider mobile robots? Our solution is to say we have a single modular robot, Watney, that can solve a lot of your transportation needs, that can synergize well and add a lot of monitoring, climate monitoring and camera monitoring to replace your sensors, to replace your crop walks, and can integrate with third-party technologies. So our thinking with Watney is that it's a blank canvas platform. So if you have I want to bring this UVC light to my plants, then we can take that, that UVC light is maybe produced by a different company. We can bring that to Watney and bring that into your facility. If you want us to integrate into your own warehouse management system or farm management system or your own sensors, we can kind of do that. So having something that's an open platform where the core of it is really, it's a mobile robot that can move very flexibly around the vertical farm and solve those kind of core processes. And then we've taken a decision to say we really want to lean into this cost effectiveness of the business. So we've decided on a robotics as a service model. So our customers, they don't buy equipment from us. They rent it on an as a service model. So that means there's a yearly fee decided per robot, and based on the equipment, it's kind of we configure the right agreement with them, and then that includes, of course, using the robot in daily production, everything like that, but also required training, service, maintenance, spare parts. There's not that kind of added surprise. If something breaks down, then we will make sure it gets fixed. If there's a software upgrade, that's all included, and we take full responsibility of running that equipment. You don't need to have an in-house robotics engineer or what have you. We'll take care of that and be there to support you on the journey with your robot. And I think that might be one of the most important value propositions, to really say, we as Seasony want to make it possible for more vertical farms to get into the world. We want to have this industry grow towards that inflection point where the industry matures and it becomes a commercially viable way of growing produce. And to help with that, we want to make it as easy as possible to start a farm. And the way we can do that is to bring cost-effective automation to vertical farms across the world. And that's really what we're trying to do with Watney.
And as a segue to looking at the future, where do you see the vertical farming industry heading? How does the future look like?
So the headline of where vertical farming is right now is that it is still an emergent technology. I think we would maybe even call it a niche business. If you look at the total amount of crops grown, the far majority is still grown outdoors, and then a very, very rapidly growing amount of crops is grown in greenhouses, and then you have this little niche of vertical farming that's also growing rapidly, but it's still very, very small. Where we think vertical farming, or where the stages vertical farming will go through, is a very similar journey as you saw with, for example, renewable energy. I think at least there's some comparisons. if you wind back time, at some point, solar power was also an expensive niche thing. The technology was there, the opportunities were there, but it was still just too unproven, too expensive to really become mainstream. But then as the technology improved, both in terms of how much did it cost, but also how much could you get out of the technology, it went from being a niche to a commercial no-brainer. Like solar power today is a commercial no-brainer. In many parts of the world, it's far cheaper even than fossil fuels. We think vertical farming will go through the same journey. But vertical farming is still at the place where the technology has a lot of improvement opportunities. You know, a lot of the seeds that are being used in vertical farming are still the seeds that's being used in greenhouses or maybe even outdoor. Or they're being used in a completely different part of the world. There's a lot of opportunities to make that technology so much more efficient, bring the cost down. It will never be as cheap, or I don't think so, I'd be surprised, but growing a head of lettuce in a vertical farm will most likely always be more expensive than growing it in a field in Italy. But it will get closer to cost comparison, and for a lot of cases it will make a lot of sense. And then I think it will split in these two directions, as we talked about, that there will be the urban farms, smaller growers growing for their community, selling through subscription bundles. You know, you get something home to yourself, you pay them directly, so you kind of bypass the whole retail chain. The smaller local producers will flourish. That will be an amazing business, I think. And then the bigger facilities, I foresee, will kind of consolidate around distribution hubs. So, you know, you have this is something I've talked to a couple of people about, that in the future, I think you'll see the big retailers or the big distributors have around the distribution centers greenhouses and vertical farms in some mix that allow them this kind of very adaptable, rapid supply of produce. You know, most recently, I think, you know, we saw Amazon invest in Hippo, which is a greenhouse producer based on robotics. But we've also seen examples here, just here in Europe, for example, you know, Coop, a supermarket chain in Norway, has invested in a pilot with Avicimo. Colruyt out of Belgium has built a system together with Mechatronics. Ocado in the UK have been super active, owns a majority in Jones Food Company, one of the biggest farms, if not the biggest in Europe. You see the retailers playing a role, saying, listen, this is our supply chain. We have an interest in actually building this up. And I think those two, like distributor and producer, will be a lot more integrated. That's what I think, at least.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of vertical integration or you know, again, to those who don't necessarily understand what the terms mean, it basically meaning that, for example, these large retail chains, they have a goal of owning as much of their overall processes, from production to sales as possible, to logistics. And I think this is going to be an interesting question, but because as an example, here in Finland, the entire retail industry is basically dominated by three players. The K Market, the Kesko Group, the S Group, and then the Lidl. And there has already been discussion about the government restricting some of the further vertical integration, because they have already so much dominant market power. So this is going to be super interesting to see where the market goes in this way, whether or not they get directly integrated into these kind of players, or do they just simply partner up and then work directly with those retailers. That's to be seen.
I think it will be closer to the latter in the short term for sure. I don't think, and I think it'll be the same for greenhouse. But the supply shocks within leafy produce that we've had in Northern Europe, you're from Finland, as you mentioned. I'm from Denmark. The UK was particularly hit. Even the climate change we see now is impacting the supply chains in Europe, and you see the same all across the world. You have areas of the world where you can't grow anything anymore. Then the supermarket chains start to see, okay, I need more security in my supply chain. I need a proof of quality. How do I get that? And I think vertical farming has a role to play in that future ecosystem.
Oh, absolutely. And as a final point, I think what you mentioned about heads of lettuce, I think vertical farming has a big role to play on specifically growing more high-cost import products that travel thousands and thousands of miles from the grower to the buyer or to the consumer, and which can easily be disrupted by the lack of water in the Panama Canal or the shipping container steering itself sideways in a canal, or then the more unfortunate cases that we're currently going through, wars or other kind of crises. But Dan, this has been super, super interesting. Thank you so much. So where can people find you and Seasony if they want to, first of all, contact you or get more information?
I think the easiest way to keep up with what we're doing is probably just to find us on LinkedIn. Search Seasony, and if you see a picture of a white mobile robot, you're on the right path. Also welcome to reach out to me personally on LinkedIn if you want to have a chat, or send me an email on dni@seasony.dk, or visit our website seasony.io. Then you can read more about what we're doing and how we're trying to transform automation in vertical farming.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oliver.
And hope to get you as a guest another time.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. Thanks for the chat.